Hey guys, tonight we trudge onto the dew-slick deck of a longship, cutting through a silent fjord under a pale pink dawn, where the salty spray ticks like tiny hammers against your woolen tunic, and the mist clings to the oaken rails like ghostly fingers. You inhale the crisp air taste, brine and pine resin, and shiver as you realize you probably won't survive the sea's whims without a stout heart and maybe a bit of luck. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments so we can map our sunrises together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward toward the prow, where a carved dragon head peers into the gray horizon, its fierce eyes carved to ward off sea spirits. In mainstream accounts, 9th to 11th century Norse fishermen set out at first light to ride the incoming tides and reach the rich herring runs before other crews arrived. An efficient system tied to lunar and tidal observations recorded in coastal rune inscriptions. You steady yourself against a gentle swell, noting how the deck's planks swell and creak with each pulse of the fjord, a reminder that even the calmest waters demand vigilance. Deckhands begin hauling the fishing nets, heavy woolen lines looped in vast swaths, preparing to drift them behind the ship's stern. You trudge aft, wincing as a coil of rope slides underfoot, slick with seawater. According to sagas and runic memorials, these nets were woven from hemp and wool, treated in tar and animal fats to resist rot, a laborious process requiring up to a week's work ashore. Yet a fringe seamstress's tale, passed down in oral ballad, insists some fishermen added strands of bear hair to nets, claiming the bristles whispered to fish, guiding them into the mesh. Historians still argue whether this practice ever existed or was poetic license to add mystique to mundane tar treatments. A low murmur ripples through the crew as the sea begins to show signs of life, fins glinting just beneath the surface, the telltale ripple of a herring shoal. You trudge along the rail to peer over the gunwale, heart quickening at the flash of silvery scales. Mainstream archaeological finds along Norwegian coasts, including fish bone middens, confirm that herring was a staple catch supporting both local diets and export to distant markets. Yet a single, enigmatic Icelandic saga recounts one fisherman who claimed to see the herring dance above the waves, a spectacle some interpret as bioluminescent plankton stirred by fish, while others dismiss it as sailors' fantasy. Scholars still debate whether any medieval observer truly witnessed glowing shoals, or whether the account reflects later embellishment. At the drum of a carved log, the captain signals for the drift net to be let loose. You brace one hand on a wooden pin that governs the net's release, its groove worn smooth by countless halts and hauls. The net drops its lead weights, plunking into the water in rhythmic succession. Mainstream maritime manuals referenced in monastic codices prescribe precise spacing of weights every 3 cubits to ensure the net hangs vertically and traps fish effectively. Yet a fringe fisherman's notebook found in a peat bog scribbles that some netcasters varied weight placement based on wind, whispering a belief that the wind's tone guided the net's sweet spot in the water. Historians still argue whether such acoustic meteorological cues ever instructed net setting or remained an evocative metaphor among seasoned crews. You trudge to the shadowed hold where barrels of salt and oak staves await the first haul. Salted cod was not only a daily staple, but a lucrative export to Baltic and Frankish markets. Mainstream trade ledgers show long-distance bartering in exchange for furs and amber. Yet a fringe merchant's song speaks of secret trade routes under moonlight, where salted fish slipped past rival crews in hollowed logs, an unsanctioned smuggling network historians still debate as minor piracy or widespread covert commerce. Above deck, clouds gather in stratified layers. The sky's muted palette, smoky grays and pale mauves, signals an incoming weather front. According to coastal lore recorded in church registers, Norse fishermen read low barometric clouds and wind shifts with uncanny accuracy, timing their returns to avoid sudden gales. You trudge to the mast to adjust a reefing line, flattening the sail's lower panels to reduce wind catch. Mainstream coastal laws, even in the 11th century Iceland, mandated reef points at 2, 4, and 6 cubits high, an innovation to stabilize vessels during storms. Yet a fringe tale warns that using the wrong reef knot invites the wrath of sea giants who tangle sails in kelp, prompting debates on whether such yarns served as a mnemonic for knot security or pure myth. Your boots slap against the wet deck as crewmates haul on halyards and brace the oars. You trudge to take your place at a midship oarlock, sliding the oar into worn leather rings. If herring supplies surge, you will row until dusk to chase drifting schools, an exhausting routine recorded in skaldic verses, describing sunburned backs and blisters as wide as palm boards. Yet an obscure runestone poem credits the god Loder with granting rowers an endless wind at their backs, a supernatural boost historians still argue reflects genuine devotional practice or poetic metaphor. A stray fish leaps arcs through the air and lands with a thud on deck, its silvery body flashing, then sliding toward the rail. You trudge forward to secure it in a net sling, your gloved hand brushing the cold scales. Mainstream cookbooks of the era describe herring bakes over open hearths, while detailed burial pits in Orkney reveal layers of smoked fish, confirming early preservation methods. Yet a fringe smocking recipe insists that first catch herring dipped in fermented bog water offered intoxicating flavors, an experimental delicacy scholars still debate as authentic taste or textual corruption. Above you, the dragonhead bows. You take a moment to feel the carved creature's carved eyes rough to the touch from centuries of weathering. Mainstream shipbuilding treatises note that dragon prows served both as figureheads and as symbol of protection against sea monsters. Yet in a single saga, a fisherman claims that his carved dragon head once spoke a single word to warn of an imminent reef strike, a tale most dismiss as the writer's fancy, though a few argue it reflects an ancient oral warning system tied to hidden reef charts. Historians still debate the veracity of such hunting legends. As the herring run peaks, you trudge back to your oar muscles, humming with anticipation. Each row stroke pulls the ship through rippled water nets, strained taut behind. The crew's synchronized rhythm, a low chant punctuated by oar slaps, echoes across the fjord like a lullaby of labor. Mainstream ethnomusicologists note that these work songs strengthened cohesion and masked fatigue, while fringe researchers speculate that certain melodic intervals matched herring swim-speak frequencies, guiding fish toward nets. Scholars still argue whether any acoustic guidance existed or remained a charming speculation. By late morning, the herring hull fills the deck barrels, brimming nets heavy and hands slick with fish oils. You trudge to the salt bins to begin the first layering salt fish. This crucial step, recorded in monastic accounts, ensured the catch preserved through winter voyages home. Yet a fringe trading post recipe adds a sprinkle of juniper berries between layers believed to ward off spoilage and impart subtle flavor. Historians still debate whether juniper use was local tradition or an imported culinary flourish. As the sun climbs, you pause at the rail to rest your oar and gaze at the glittering hull. Silver scales catch the light, casting dancing reflections on the fjord walls. Despite the brisk chill, a surge of warmth lifts your spirits today. You've witnessed the sea's bounty and your own resilience, because in medieval Norse fishing, dawn on the fjord was not merely a starting point. It was a crucible of mist, salt, sweat, and song, where only those who heeded tide's nets and old sea ghost tales could last until dusk. You trudge from the prow into the tangle of ropes and wooden spars clustered around the mast's base, your boots scraping over coiled lines slick with resin. Above you, a web of rigging rises like a forest of dark branches against the pale sky, each rope and spar engineered to catch the fickle northern winds. You clutch a thick hemp halyard in one hand and feel its rough fibers bite into your leather glove as you prepare to hoist the sail, an essential task for every medieval Norse fisherman. Because now it is time for rigging and sails. In mainstream shipbuilding treatises of the Viking-Age longships employed a single square sail made from linen or wool, often reinforced with horizontal wooden slats called sailusk to give shape and control. You trudge around the mast to the port side, where the sail lies furled in thick folds dyed in ochre and indigo. Historically, sail dimensions varied by vessel size. A carvy small fishing boat might sport a sail 20 square cubits in area, while larger Skadar warships stretched sails to 60. Yet all relied on the same simple principle, catching the wind like a giant woven wing. Your first challenge is untangling the tampar, the leash lines, securing the sail's lower corners. A misplaced knot can jam the unfurling sequence, so you carefully loosen each lashing. You notice one tampar loop coiled too tightly around the yardarm. A fringe seamstress legend claims that by braiding extra flax into these loops, fishermen believed the sail would catch extra gusts, steering the ship through calm patches. Historians still argue whether such decorative braiding held any practical merit or served purely as folk ritual among superstitious seafarers. You trudge back to the mast and find the main sheet, a heavy rope controlling the sail's angle looped around a sturdy wooden cleat. With a grunt, you unfasten it and prepare to haul. Mainstream seamanship manuals emphasize maintaining a loose belly in the sail when heading downwind. Too tight, and the sail snaps too loose, and it slaps the spars violently. Yet every sailor learned by feel, a brief tug, a test pull, then adjust. Fringe accounts speak of a secret whisper, not a hidden loop, tied under the throat. Halyards said to allow a swift reefing spot when storms bore down. Scholars still debate whether this knot appears in archaeological remnants or exists only in oral lore. Below deck, the foresail, a supplementary foresail, waits stored in a waterproof bundle. On larger fishing vessels, deploying a foresail provided extra speed when herring runs required quick returns before a gale. You trudge to the bow, undo the bundle, and with a swift tug raise the smaller sail, securing its sheets to a pair of belaying pins. Mainstream iconographic carvings in stave churches depict both square mainsails and triangular foresails on voyages to Iceland, suggesting Norse sailors refined multi-sail rigs earlier than previously believed. Yet a lone 12th century traveler's note insists foresails were frowned upon by purists, a debate historians still pursue regarding conservative seamanship traditions versus practical innovation. Back on deck, you trudge beneath the waiting sailcloth, bracing your shoulder against the mast as you heave on the halyard. Each pull inches the sail upward, unraveling folds until a vast expanse of woolen canvas snaps free. You pause to hook a wooden peg through a row of hog-belter iron rings sewn along the sail's edge, locking the sail to the yard. Mainstream textile analyses reveal that medieval sailcloth was often oiled with animal fat and seaweed extract, repelling water and extending service life. Yet fringe coastal lore claims fishermen sometimes steeped sails in peat smoke before voyages to ward off lightning strikes, a practice scholars still debate as meteorological precaution or symbolic ritual. With a grunt and a coordinated heave alongside two deckhands, you haul the sail to its peak. The yardarm creaks as it pivots on the mast's horn, and the sail unfurls in a billowing wave. A sudden gust of wind fills the cloth, sending a lurch through the hull and flattening you against the mast. The whole ship shivers as the sail catches the fjord breeze. Mainstream treatises on wind dynamics note that square sails perform best on broad reaches, wind blowing across the stern quarter, while headwinds require careful tacking, weaving the ship side to side. Yet Norse crews seldom sought headlands in open fjords, preferring running, before predictable winds and returning under oar power when necessary. You trudge to the stern to ease the main sheet, adjusting the sail's heel to match the wind's angle. The simple block and tackle pulley gives you mechanical advantage, but it's still hard work fighting gusts. A fringe skipper's tale tells of a captain who waited for a full moon to reef the sail, believing the tidal pull, then steadied wind gusts for reefing. Scholars still question whether any data supported lunar reefing or it remained a whimsical myth to explain calm nights when reefing succeeded unexpectedly. As the sail steadies, you trudge along the deck, patting its taut surface like a living creature. Painted in stripes of ochre and natural wool, the sail's design often expressed clan allegiance or boasted victories in fishing competitions ashore. Mainstream rune-inscribed relics occasionally include references to sail banners carried to markets as tokens of skill. Yet island folk poems recount one small fishing boat whose sail unfurled with daring crimson stripes so intimidated neighboring crews that it often gained first pick of herring shoals until rival nets sabotaged its lines at night. Historians still debate whether such sabotage tales reflect real intervillage rivalry or playful poetic fiction. With the sail set and the sun climbing over distant peaks, you trudge back to your oarlock muscles already humming from morning tasks. Below deck, the steeremater helmsman adjusts the steering oar ancient guidance into the sail's interplay with current. You slip into your seat alongside 7 other rowers' blades, poised for drift or headwind. As the longship glides under combined oar and sail power, you feel the foal skim the water, a shard of living oak slicing through fjord glass. Because in medieval Norse fishing rigging and sails were not just equipment, they were a complex dance of rope wind and ritual where each knot, each reef, and each oiled canvas wove together seamanship, superstition, and community ingenuity into every voyage's heartbeat. You trudge along the deck as the longship slows into a sheltered cove, where the water's surface erupts in silver flashes, herring shoals so dense they turn the fjord into a living mirror. Nets and oars are laid aside as the crew converges on the rail, anticipation crackling in the salty air like static. Today's bounty hinges on this moment, the herring run fever that pulses through Norse fishing life once each summer. In mainstream historical accounts, medieval Norse communities timed their fishing expeditions around the annual herring migrations, which followed plankton blooms in June and July. Chroniclers in the Hanseatic cities marveled that entire coastlines would teem with fish so abundant they could be caught by hand. You lean over the rail, fingers grazing the frigid water as tiny fish brush past like living currents, an experience echoed in archaeological middens filled with herring bones at sites from Bergen to the Faroes. Yet amid this ecological certainty lay fringe lore of the silver tide omens. One 12th century skaldic verse claims that if a single herring flipped onto the deck before nets were cast, the entire run would fail an omen, so feared that some crews delayed netting until 3 fish landed naturally. Scholars still argue whether these legends reflect genuine superstitions that influenced fishing timing, or whether they emerged later as cautionary tales about hubris before the sea. You trudge to a coiled drift net hanging over the rail and help pass it around the stern. The main net stretches 50 cubits long, its fine mesh woven from hemp and treated in seal oil to resist tearing. Mainstream fishing guild records prescribe nets of this length to encircle shoals effectively. Yet local variations abounded. Orkney fishermen favored shorter nets to navigate narrow sounds, while Lofoten crews used extra-wide webs to sweep broader swaths. Yet a fringe innovation in one remote village added extra loops sewn with braided kelp strands, said to mimic seaweeds swirl and confuse herring into the net's jaws. Historians still debate whether kelp loops ever improved catch rates or were simply an eco-friendly embellishment. As the nets settle and drift, you trudge to the bow to stand watch. Crewmates hum a low chant and ancient work song, with lyrics comparing shoals to clouds of silver moths. Mainstream ethnomusicologists note that these chants synchronized rowing and hauling, while fringe musicologists claim the song's melody imitates herring's clicking swim patterns, guiding the nets toward denser pockets. Scholars still argue whether any acoustic mimicry truly influenced fish behavior or remained sailors' poetic metaphor. Moments later, the water stiffens as the nets snag on schooling fish. The wood blocks groan as dozens of men heave in unison, pulling the nets toward the hull. You trudge aft to brace against a billowing bulge beneath the waves' muscles straining. Mainstream sagas recount herring hauls so heavy that crews abandoned other tasks for days working in shifts to clear decks and pack barrels. Yet a fringe entry in a widow's lament poem warns of herring fever delirium, a maddening enchantment, causing crews to shun all other duties until nets lay empty. Whether this fever was literal exhaustion in Damus delirium or a poetic exaggeration, historians still debate. You trudge to the stern platform where wooden stakes, harp logs, secure the net ends. As the bulge crests, you thrust a harp log through the mesh to hold it fast, feeling its teeth bite the fibers. Mainstream treatises note that harp logs required precise spacing 2 cubits apart to maintain net tension. Too close and fish chafed through mesh. Too far and the net sagged, letting shoals slip away. Yet an apprentice's notebook found in a peat bog describes harp logs carved from reindeer, antler lighter, but prone to splintering, a trade-off still debated among historians as innovative or impractical. With the net held, the crew slashes the upper mesh to let fish pour onto the deck. You trudge forward as a silver cascade crashes below scales, flying like sparks, and fish flopping in a living tide. Mainstream fish processing manuals describe the immediate need to gut and salt herring within an hour to prevent spoilage, an urgent chore in the damp northern heat. Yet in one fringe recipe, circulated among coastal farmsteads, Cooks applied a thin coating of fermented kelp juice to freshly gutted herring before salting, claiming it imparted a sweet, umami note cherished by locals. Scholars still argue whether kelp fermenting was a genuine medieval practice or a modern revivalist invention. You trudge to the deck's edge, scoop handfuls of fish, and fling them into wooden barrels pre-lined with coarse salt. Each barrel holds enough herring for dozens of families over winter months. Mainstream trade records show these salted barrels fueled not only local feasts, but also continental markets as far as Bruges and London. Yet a whisper among older fishermen speaks of clandestine barrels stuffed with fresh fish bartered locally for fresh vegetables, bypassing salt houses entirely. Historians still debate whether fresh fish trade ever rivaled the salted export economy or remained sporadic barter. As your hands slick with fish oils, you feel the day's fever settle into tired satisfaction. Nets are emptied barrels sealed and salt sprinkled in final layers. You trudge to the mast shadow as the crew drills holes in barrel lids, marking each with tally slashes to track volume and early form of cargo manifest. Mainstream maritime laws required these markings to be recorded before departure, yet an isolated foreman's diary recounts one day when tally marks vanished overnight, attributed to herring weevil's mischievous shore, spirits blamed for cargo discrepancies. Scholars still question whether weevil tales reflect real pests or metaphorical blame for missing fish. Above the sun climbs high, casting diamond-like patterns on the barrel tops. You pause, feeling the ebb of adrenaline, and trudge aft to rinse your hands in the cool fjord water, watching as fish oil swirls in rainbow sheens. This rinse dissolves the worst of the stink and readies you for the next leg-hauling gear, mending nets, and preparing for storms to come. Because in medieval Norse fishing, herring run fever was not merely a seasonal event. It was a pulse that drove community rhythm song. Superstition and trade testing every crewmate's skill strength and resolve in the flicker of silver beneath rolling waves. You trudge to the row of oarlocks lining each side of the longship, where polished oaken tholes gleam with salt and sweat. The deck beneath your boots pitches gently with each swell, and you steady yourself against the bulging drift net now stowed below. Beside you, 8 other crew members settle into their thwarts grips, firm on long ash oars carved to fit each row locker. The sky above is a pale wash of morning light, but already you can feel a stiffening breeze on your face as the ship settles into its next rhythm, rowing rhythms. In mainstream Norse seamanship, rowing was not just backup for windless days. It was primary propulsion in narrow fjords when tides ran counter to the sails or during tactical maneuvers close to shore. You slide your oar into the iron-studded rowlock, the flat blade dipping into the brine with a muted swoosh. A hush falls as the helmsman steeremater calls out the rowing cadence in firm measured tones. Have you hear over the lapping sea, and every oar pulls back in unison. Log, you push forward in time with the next swell. This call and response, recorded in skaldic verses, kept up to 40 rowers, synchronized on larger vessels, ensuring efficient progress and preventing the oarlocks from jamming. As you trudge through your stroke plant blade, pivot body drive, back you feel each muscle fiber awaken, biceps tightening, shoulders rotating, core bracing against the ship's roll. The helmsman's voice echoes again. Hav lag, a fringe drill guide whispered in hushed tones among seasoned rowers, suggests subtler variations for headwinds. Quicken the hav by half a beat to keep momentum. For following seas elongate the log to let the stern catch the swell and propel the hull forward. Historians still argue whether these whispered refinements were widespread practice or layered on later by saga poets seeking drama. You trudge to match your neighbor's cadence, glancing at his chapped knuckles curling around the shaft. His oar is slightly longer than yours, an adaptation from a Shetland craft he once saw meant to give extra reach in narrow channels. Mainstream shipwright manuals recognized regional variations. Deep V hulls needed shorter oars for leverage, whereas broad fishing vessels used longer oars for stability in open waters. Yet a marginal forum poem claims that in one moonlit skirmish, a clever rower shortened his oar, covertly transforming it into an improvised spear to fend off boarders, an episode scholars still debate as plausible innovation or bordello gossip. As you drive the oar back, water spills over the blade's edge in a fine arc, droplets sparkling in the yawning dawn. 8 symmetrical arcs on each side of the hull lay tracks of foam marking your progress. Mainstream maritime archaeology notes that these uniform ripples reduce turbulence, allowing longships to achieve speeds up to 8 knots under oar power alone. Yet fringe chronicles among coastal farmers speak of mythical rowers born with sea-born sinews who could row for days without rest, an exaggeration historians still consider part of Norse hyperbole rather than human physiology. You trudge through another pull, noticing how the stern turns slightly as the oars on your side lift in perfect mirror. This subtle yaw is countered by slight adjustments in oar angle expert rowers leaning their bodies forward or back to steer the hull. Mainstream treatises on small vessel handling mention this rowing helm critical when rounding promontories or slipping between reefs. Yet a fringe navigator's note lauds the use of rhythmic whistle blasts to signal crew when steering corrections were needed rather than voice calls, an acoustic method scholars still debate as effective in windy conditions or purely theatrical. At the third rally of Hav lag, the ship glides past a craggy shoreline where seabirds wheel. You trudge to match your stroke, to the gull's cries gripping your oar with renewed vigor as the chant swells into a faster tempo. Mainstream ethnomusicology links these chants to ancient work songs found in other maritime cultures, suggesting convergent evolution of rowing rhythms across seafaring societies. Yet a marginal balladier's verse claims that the original chant, derived from imitating whales' song heard beneath the hull, an origin story scholars still argue as fanciful or possible. After 20 minutes of steady rowing, your arms burn and sweat drips from your forehead, but the helmsman's calm voice maintains the cadence. You trudge through each oar pull as if it were the same as the first plant pivot push, finding a meditative calm in the repetition. Modern exercise physiology confirms that such steady-state rowing promotes muscular endurance, though medieval rowers called it atakvidger, 8 breaths dividing pulls into comfortable cycles of 8 strokes before a brief mutual pause. You trudge toward the center of the ship, where a carved wooden stamping board lies ready for shift changes. When the helmsman calls skall, all 8 oars lift together and the chant halts abruptly. You slide your oar free, pass it to the next shift, and step aside, muscles trembling as fresh rowers take your place. Mainstream crew logs detail these shifts, 2-hour pulls, alternating with rest periods, ensuring constant vigilance and preventing collapse under exhaustion. Yet a fringe diary of a stranded crew recalls improvised shifts of mere minutes when herring runs peaked each rower, pushing beyond collapse to net more fish. An exception historians still debate as desperation or determined overdrive. As the new shift settles, you trudge toward the stern, grateful for the brief respite. The oar's arc fades into distant motion, and the chant dies down to the sound of wind and wave. Your heart pounds each beat, echoing the rhythm of blades through water. You trudge to the rail, lean out to rinse your hands in the cold fjord, and feel the stark contrast between brutal labor and the sea's cool embrace. Because in medieval Norse fishing, rowing rhythms were not mere background tasks. They were communal cadences, rhythmic meditations, and tactical maneuvers, all at once, weaving every soul aboard into a living, breathing longship heart. You trudge forward as the wind shifts, and dark clouds loom on the horizon like gathering armies, their low undersides glowing with a muted greenish cast. The longship's mast creaks in protest as gusts sweep over the fjord, carrying the scent of distant thunder. You tighten your woolen hood and grip the rail, bracing yourself against the vessel's sudden lurch, because now it is time for storm cloud shadows. Mainstream Norse seamanship treatises, passed down through runic inscriptions and coastal lore, warn that summer storms can form in minutes when warm inland air meets cold sea breezes. You watch as a squall line advances its leading edge, marked by funnel-shaped dark clouds and the first fat drops of rain spattering the deck. In 10th century chronicles, coastal skalds describe these storms as sky whales' giant dark forms that bore down on ships with crushing wind. Mariners depended on barometric observations. Rising pressure promised calm, while a sudden drop heralded squalls, but they had no instruments beyond their own senses. You trudge to the mast base and jibe the sail pulling on the halyard as the canvas snaps and bellows in the gathering wind. Mainstream archaeological finds of iron rigging fittings reveal Norse ships carried multiple reef points, allowing crews to reduce sail area quickly and avoid capsizing. Yet a fringe saga tells of a fishing vessel that reefed the sail only halfway half-reefed. They called it, believing the half-moon reef held magical balance between speed and safety. Historians still argue whether half-reefing ever provided any real advantage or remained a poetic caution against over-caution. You trudge across the wet deck as the first lightning fork cracks overhead, illuminating the dragonhead prow in stark, strobing relief. Gasps ripple through the crew, and someone murmurs the name of Odin in a nervous underbreath. Mainstream devotional inscriptions found on runestones show that fishermen often invoked Thor for protection, carrying small, hammer-shaped amulets to ward off Thunder's wrath. Yet some coastal superstitions held that naming Thor aloud during a storm risked attracting his attention and provoking more fury, a contradiction scholars still debate as regional variation versus conflicting oral traditions. A sudden gust catches the partially reefed sail, tilting the longship so sharply you have to grip a nearby belaying pin to keep from sliding into the rail. You trudge to secure the main sheet, belaying it at a lower cleat to spill wind from the sail's lower panel. Mainstream seamanship manuals note that spilling wind loosening the sheet to reduce force helps stabilize a broad-beamed vessel in gusts, preventing sudden heeling. Yet a marginal entry in a boatwright's handbook complains that spilling too much wind left ships at the mercy of following seas, prompting captains to balance between too much sail and too little, an open debate among modern marine historians. Rain begins in earnest, drumming on the wooden deck like 1,000 tiny hammers. You trudge to slide hatches closed to keep the hold dry, spraying rivulets of water at your boots. Mainstream shipboard accounts emphasize that fish oil-treated hatch covers and tar-sealed seams kept cabins watertight, but constant maintenance was required. Tar tubs and brushes rode under the forecastle. Yet a fringe carpenter's verse claims that some crews mixed crushed shark teeth into deck tar to improve its grip, an unverified recipe that historians still argue was practical grit or sailors' tall tale embellishment. The wind shifts to a howling gale. You trudge to the stern and help turn the steering oar, angling the blade to hold a lee shore off your starboard side. Mainstream nautical records advise keeping a windward course, heading into the wind at a steep angle to avoid being driven onto rocks. Yet the longship's shallow keel, limited windward ability forcing captains to hug the coast in narrow passages. Fringe navigator notes claim some helmsmen used hidden lead lines dropped overboard, listening for changes in water. Sound to gauge depth, an acoustic echo-sounding technique scholars still debate as proto-sonar or fanciful myth. Lightning flashes again, and the mast's shadow flickers across the deck like a stalking beast. You trudge to batten down spare lines, tying them in double loops to prevent whipping ropes from slicing through hands. Mainstream cordage treatises recommend eye-splice terminations to prevent fraying an expert skill passed among shipwrights. Yet some fishermen preferred simple round turns and half hitches for speed in storms, arguing that fussy splices wasted precious seconds when the sea turned lethal. Historians still discuss whether spliceless rigging dominated in practice, or whether textbooks overstated splice usage. Thunder roars as a peak wind gust hits, pitching the longship into a trough so deeply that spray washes over the rail and soaks your knees. You trudge to secure your own hood, mud-caked and dripping, and catch a glimpse of the dragonhead half submerged amid white-capped waves. Mainstream sagas relate that sea-serpents hid beneath longships during storms drawn by carved prows. Whether these tales reflect real fear of sea snakes or dramatized accounts of overwhelmed sailors, they reveal the psychological toll of stormy voyages. Some coastal path etchings show mythical serpent figures entwined with longship images, suggesting a blend of maritime hazard and myth. Amid the chaos, a seasoned deckhand shouts "Have," and the crew tacks briefly, dumping the sail to spill wind before quickly resetting on the other tack. Mainstream seamanship texts describe tacking as a risky maneuver for square-sail vessels often avoided except in dire need. Yet the Norse, renowned for agility, developed quick tacking drills. Evidence in later rune-carved wharves instructs crews to practice the maneuver annually. Fringe maritime lore credits these drills to early contact with Mediterranean sailors, but scholars still argue whether tacking originated locally or arrived through limited trade. A flash of lightning splits the sky, and rain hammers your shoulders like frozen pebbles. You trudge to the forward rails to assist with a bilge pump, a simple lever and bucket arrangement, prying water from the hold. Mainstream shipboard records note that constant pumping prevented deadly swamping. Each crew member assigned a pump watch. Exceptionally, some vessels mounted 2 pumps amidships for redundancy, an innovation historians still debate as practical upgrade or theoretical ideal. Suddenly, the wind dies as quickly as it rose, leaving the longship listing in a calm eye of the storm. You trudge to the mast and watch as the first pale sunbeams pierce gray clouds, illuminating a shimmering curtain of rain trailing offshore. Mainstream meteorological observations by coastal farmers confirm that Norse regions experience sudden squall winds followed by equally abrupt calms. Some suggest these were downbursts, localized microbursts, though medieval observers interpreted them as the exhalations of giant sea dragons returning to the deep. Historians still debate whether such dragon metaphors reflected advanced local weather understanding or mythic storytelling. As the crew recovers, you trudge back to your oarlock muscles, quivering from the storm's exertions. Nets and sails lie flaccid under slate skies awaiting the next breeze. The deck slick with brine and rain glistens like black obsidian under the clearing sky. Because in medieval Norse fishing, storm cloud shadows were not mere weather events. They were elemental trials of seamanship ritual and resilience, testing every sailor's skill and nerve amid sudden fury and quiet reprieves. You trudge aft boots splashing through shallow puddles on the deck and pause beside the carved dragonhead prow that once guided your vessel through calm fjord waters. Now, in this uneasy twilight after the storm, every ripple and shadow beneath the hull seems to stir ancient sea-serpents from the depths. The crew's conversations fall to hushed whispers as you prepare to share the next secret of Norse fishing lore, sea serpent superstitions. In mainstream Norse folklore tales of sea serpents, Hafgufa Lingbakker and Ormar loomed large, their vast coils said to create whirlpools when they submerged and to capsize unwary ships. Medieval skalds described the Hafgufa as a gargantuan creature whose mouth, when opened to feed on plankton, dwarfed small fishing vessels. Archaeological digs along the Norwegian coast have uncovered amulets shaped like coiled serpents, suggesting fishermen wore them for protection against these dangers. Yet historians still argue whether these mythic beasts represented actual fear of large whales or remained purely symbolic warnings against complacency on the open sea. You trudge toward the rope ladder dangling over the side, grip its wet rungs and pause to listen. The sea's low moan seems to resonate with the boat's timbers, as if the hull itself murmurs of hidden coils beneath. Fringe lore insists that attentive sailors could hear the faint echoes of a serpent's breath in these murmurs, an uncanny resonance signaling that a beast stirred below. Skeptical scholars still debate whether any acoustic phenomena could carry through hull and water to masquerade as monster breath, or whether such tales simply emerged to explain inexplicable groans in old ships. Below deck, a fellow deckhand, eyes wide, produces a small carved whalebone talisman shaped like an eel. "Slip this into the bilge," he whispers, "and the serpent will think the hull is its own kind." Mainstream ethnographic study confirmed that Norse fishermen kept a variety of charms, rune-engraved wood whalebone carvings, and iron bits believed to ward off storms and sea creatures alike. Yet a marginal saga notes that one skipper, heavily skeptical, ignored these charms, only to have his ship's rudder jam when he mocked them. Historians still argue whether that incident reflected real sabotage, mechanical failure, or poetic justice woven into the tale. You trudge back above scanning the dark water's surface. A sudden swirl forms amid scattered logs left by the storm, and half your crew tenses. Half goofa, someone breathes. In truth, the swirl is more likely an eddy caught on submerged rocks, a commonplace hazard marked on coastal runic charts. But superstition thrives when fear runs high and crew members pinch at their talisman strings, crossing themselves in a gesture more Christian than Old Norse tradition. As dusk deepens, you trudge to the stern, where a sailor stretches a length of braided gut line across the deck and drapes it with shimmering fish scales. He explains in a low voice that the scales mimic fish schools, distracting the serpent's attention away from the hull. Modern marine biologists note that fish scales lose luster quickly and offer no acoustic or visual camouflage in open water yet. The superstition persisted, perhaps reflecting a desperate bid to exert any control over mysterious sea forces. A lightning-scarred post from yesterday's storm now stands amid the deck planks, rough-hewn and leaning slightly. It once held a small carved wooden head of the Midgard serpent, Jormungandr, placed there by the ship's sponsor before launch. Mainstream rune stonemasons often left such figureheads in neighboring villages, symbols of solidarity and shared superstition, while fringe runecaster circles insisted that the serpent's head functioned as both ward and warning beacon. Scholars still debate whether figureheads ever served practical hydrodynamic functions or were purely apotropaic devices. You trudge to the mast base, where a narrow stained glass lantern hangs an unlikely medieval import, yet found in coastal trading posts. Its flickering light, according to local superstition, cast shining patterns that resembled fish scales on the water, luring the serpent to follow its glow away from the hull. Historians still argue whether glass lanterns ever found their way onto fishing boats in significant numbers, or whether these references belong to later romanticized accounts of North Sea trade. Now a distant gurgle ripples beneath the hull, and the longship shudders. Crewmates scramble to peer over the rail. A dark mass drifts past, long, sinuous, and wider than any known fish. Hearts pound as dozens of pairs of eyes fix on its wake. Yet before fear freezes you, the mass dissolves into a school of large cod slipping beneath the keel. Mainstream oceanographers confirm that cod schools can create confusing shapes in low light, especially when currents swirl fish close to the surface. Yet whispers of cod serpents linger among the superstitious tales passed from shore to ship, snarled into the tapestry of maritime myth. You trudge back from the rail as the crew lets out shaky laughter. One older deckhand raps his knuckles on the dragonhead carved prow and whispers a curt blessing, an old rite said to reassert dominion when mythic beasts encroached. Others hollow suit, tapping their oar handles on the hull in rhythmic thumps, a communal percussion marking a return to normalcy. This spontaneous ritual, scholars note, exemplifies how superstition and practical seamanship intertwined beats on the hull test its integrity while offering psychological reassurance. Finally, you trudge to a small weathered journal strapped to the mast, the captain's log of unholy tides, where a brief entry notes cod shadows, seen at dusk, no serpent stirred. Mainstream historians treasure such logs for glimpses into everyday belief and observation. Yet a marginal note jotted beneath return Jormungandr's fang remains illegible on the page's edge. Some suggest it refers to a lost amulet, others to a cursed tooth said to ward off storms. Scholars still debate its meaning, emblematic of countless ambiguities in Norse maritime lore. Because in medieval Norse fishing, sea serpent superstitions were not mere fairy tales. They were woven into every voyage's rhythm, guiding amulets and rituals, stoking fear and forging solidarity as fishermen learn to row sail and believe in mysteries beneath the waves. You trudge from the dragonhead's shadow back toward the stern, where wooden barrels half submerged in brine tubs line the deck like silent sentinels guarding today's hull. The gulls wheel overhead, their cries mixing with the hiss of salt spray. Beside you, a veteran deckhand thumbs a knife with a hooked blade, an essential tool for splitting fresh herring before salting. This moment marks the next crucial task of survival salted fish preservation. In mainstream medieval Norse practice, freshly caught herring blood, drained heads removed, were layered in barrels with coarse sea salt, a ratio of roughly 1 part salt to 4 parts fish. By volume ensured dehydration and inhibited bacterial growth. You trudge along the row of barrels as crews heave handfuls of salt from woven sacks, salt harvested from evaporated shallow pans on Skagerrak shores, a vital commodity traded north from Hanseatic merchants. Each fish layer is carefully arranged, belly down to allow the salt to draw moisture evenly. Historical accounts note that well-packed barrels kept fish edible for up to a year, a lifeline for inland farms cut off by winter snows. Yet, amid this pragmatic method, a fringe recipe surfaced in an 11th century saga after the first layer of salt, and fish rowers were to sprinkle crushed bark of the juniper bush, believed to impart antimicrobial oils and a hint of resinous flavor. Modern chemical analysis confirms juniper contains antiseptic compounds, though scholars still debate whether medieval fishermen intentionally harnessed these properties, or if the practice began as a taste experiment later romanticized into myth. You trudge to the next barrel, where a young apprentice taps the lid to settle its contents. gentle raps that echo hollowly when the salt fish cake is properly compacted. Mainstream Cooper's Guild regulations required that barrels be free of cracks and fitted with precisely sawn lids to maintain airtight seals. Yet a marginal note in a coastal law code allows apprentices to substitute birch bark layers when oak staves ran short, a substitution some masters claimed lent a subtle sweetness, provoking debate among historians whether birch barrel curing was widespread or a stopgap workaround. Above deck's bustle, the scent of salt and brine mingles with the sharper tang of fermenting fish oils seeping between barrel cracks. You trudge to a tar-soaked rag used to wipe down barrel exteriors and prevent insect infestations. Mainstream ethnographic studies record that fish-eating flies and barnacle larvae threatened both preservation and hull integrity. Barrels were often tar-wrapped to deter pests and water ingress alike. Yet fringe fisherwomen's lore insisted weaving tiny sprigs of wormwood into the tar coat kept evil spirits and actual vermin at bay. Scholars still argue whether wormwood had genuine repellent effects or functioned as charming ritual. As you trudge between barrels, you spot a small wooden label tied around a stout stave, scratched with runes indicating catch date and origin fjord. Mainstream archival finds of such barrel tags at Hedeby excavations confirm the prevalence of dated labels enabling seasonal stock rotation. Yet a lone diary fragment from a trader complains of rogue barrels mislabeled by unscrupulous crews, an accusation historians still debate as anecdote or evidence of early market fraud. Nearby, a deckhand pierces a small drainage bung to sample brine density, a simple test. If the herring float barely submerged, there's just enough salt. If they sink fully, the brine's too weak. Mainstream culinary treatises of the era recommend weekly brine checks to add salt or fresh water as needed. Fringe culinary manuscripts, however, advocate adding a spoonful of fermented fish oil to the brine, claiming it deepened flavor and accelerated curing. Scholars still dispute whether oil-fortified brine ever formed part of authentic medieval practice or is later embellishment. You trudge to the rail and rinse your hands in the fjord, washing away sticky salt crystals before they etch your skin. Each rinse sends briny currents across the deck and into your sleeves, a reminder that preservation requires constant vigilance. Mainstream hygiene advisories rare, for the period warned that prolonged contact with salt could crack hands, so fishermen wore simple leather gloves or applied whale blubber salve. Yet a fringe midwife's poem praises goat fat salve scented with pine pitch as the ultimate skin protectant, an assertion historians still weigh against archaeological evidence of leather gauntlets. As the sun dips low, you trudge back to the barrel's row and secure each lid with tight wooden hoops using a spokes-have-like tool to tighten metal bands. This final lash ensures no tide or tide slug can breach the cure. Mainstream naval stores' inventories list barrel hoops among the most essential repair parts on fishing vessels. Unsurprisingly, barrels doubled as emergency bilge patches in dire storms. Yet a fringe sailor's yarn tells of one barrel held a secret cache of salted cod mixed with honeyed apple slices, a treat so coveted it nearly sparked a deck mutiny when discovered. Historians still question whether sweetfish bunkers ever existed or served as cautionary myths of sailors' appetites. With the barrels sealed and stacked along the deck's center line, you trudge toward the ship's prow, the weight of preserved fish heavy in the hold. Today's work ensures the crew and your family ashore will feast weeks beyond the herring run's end. In the hush of twilight, each barrel's salted legacy stands testament to centuries-old ingenuity, the art of turning fleeting bounty into lasting sustenance. Because in medieval Norse fishing, salted fish preservation was not mere housekeeping. It was alchemy of saltwood and weather, a testament to human ingenuity that carried fjord harvests through storm frost and famine alike. You trudge from the barrel-packed deck into the shadowed gloom beneath the raised forecastle, where rows of woolen garments and goat hair cloaks hang from pegs to air out before nightfall. Beyond them, at the mast's base, rests a collection of leather caps, thick woolen mittens, and tightly woven linen undergarments, the essential ensemble of Norse helmets and weatherproof gear that shielded fishermen against fjord's relentless chill. In mainstream Viking-Age attire, fishermen layered linen undergarments against their skin, followed by woolen tunics and trousers with leather jerkins or goatskin cloaks for wind and spray. You trudge into the soft glow of an oil lantern and lift a coiled woolen cap, knitted with a pointed crown, its ribbed brim designed to trap heat around the ears. Archaeological finds in Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials include similarly constructed caps underscoring their ubiquity. Yet scholars still argue whether these caps were everyday wear or reserved for seafaring specialists. You trudge over to a set of iron-reinforced leather helmets, simple skull caps with nasal guards, far lighter than their warlike counterparts. Textural analysis confirms these helmets were hardened by smoking in peat fires, rendering them both waterproof and tough. According to saga references, fishermen donned these helmets during winter brigades when ice floes threatened to crack heads like eggs. Yet a fringe Kenning's poem vividly describes frost fangs that bit through leather, implying even hardened caps could fail in Arctic gales, an image historians still debate as literal hazard or poetic hyperbole. From a low bench, you pick up a pair of mittens crafted from reindeer hide seams, turned outward to wick moisture away. Mainstream ethnographic studies note Reindeer fur's hollow hairs provide exceptional insulation, while hides' natural oils repel water. Yet a marginal fisher's journal praises the addition of seal fat rubbed into the leather, its greasy sheen sealing stitch holes, though some masters derided this as making grips too slippery in oarlocks. Historians still contend whether seal fat treatment balanced waterproofing against functional grip. You trudge along to a row of waist belts where small pouches hold flint and steel kits, tinder pouches, and carved soapstone lamps. In Norse gear lore, readily available fire-starting tools were vital after wet decks extinguished hearth fires. Each kit rested in a leather box treated with fish oil for water resistance, yet a fringe, rune-inscribed tinderbox warns against carrying fire kits above deck in storms, lest lightning claim your soul in sparks. An admonition scholars still debate as practical lightning lore or pious caution. Beside the belts hangs a length of braided woolen rope, about finger-thick dyed yellow with birch bark. This thick cord served as both a hatband and emergency tether fishermen could cut small strips in desperation to lash sails or secure tools. Mainstream textile studies confirm birch bark dye's light-fast quality, while fringe herbal treatises claim the bark's tannins warded off lice and fleas, tiny scourges in damp shipboard living. Historians still argue whether lice-resistant dyes were intentional health measures or side effects of available materials. You trudge to an iron hook embedded in the wall where a folded goatskin cloak hangs its hood lined with sheepskin for extra warmth. The cloak's shape, cut with wide shoulders and side slits, allowed freedom of movement when handling nets. Mainstream reenactment guilds praise these cloaks for their balance of protection and mobility. Yet coastal superstition held that cutting side slits under a new moon blessed the wearer with wind's sly step, making them lighter on deck, an esoteric tailoring ritual scholars still question as genuine practice or later invention. Above small leather pouches labeled with runic initials hold tooth-sized chunks of birch tar sticky resin used to waterproof seams and mend torn garments quickly. You trudge closer and squeeze a tar piece, releasing a smoky pitch aroma. Mainstream Cooper's handbooks note birch tar's early use in Viking boat maintenance, while fringe tanning lore asserts that wearing tar pouch near the heart protected miners' souls from icy death. Scholars still debate if tar charms formed part of genuine belief or were sailors' jokes that became legend. From a barrel you retrieve a linen shirt woven so tightly the weave resembles cloth armor, providing windbreak and quick drying. You trudge back to the cap peg to pair this shirt with a thick woolen hooded surcoat, its hem trimmed with sheepskin. Mainstream textile excavations show linen-wool blends were prized for their balance of warmth and breathability. Yet an obscure ballad suggests that weavers recited rhythmic charms during weaving to imbue the garments with stitch-spun vigor, a ritual whose reality historians still argue based on scant evidence. Lastly, you trudge toward the stern, where a stack of wooden clogs rests simple boards carved to fit feet tied with leather straps. These clogs kept feet elevated above wet decks and protected against dropped nets or oar snaps. Mainstream footgear studies identify similar clogs in peat bog finds across Scandinavia. Yet a fringe lore holds that saying "step steady" 3 times while donning clogs cemented one's footing in storms, an oral charm scholars still debate as mnemonic cue or superstition. You trudge back through the gear, touching each weatherproof piece, a testament to centuries of adaptation. Each cap, cloak, and mitten tells a story of storms, weathered hands warmed, and lives spared. Because in medieval Norse fishing helmets and weatherproof gear were not mere attire. They were life's first defense, woven with craft innovation and charms that kept hearts warm and bodies afloat on the fjord's fickle embrace. You trudge toward the raised shoreline encampment, where stout tents of woven wool and cured leather await by flickering brazier fires. The scent of drying nets mingles with wood smoke, and lanterns cast long shadows as the coastal camp's hearths come alive. Here on the edge of land and sea, the unsung heroines of every fishing voyage, women of the Norse communities, gather to carry out vital shore duties Norse women at shore. In mainstream sagas and law codes, Norse women held defined roles in coastal economies, mending nets, salting fish, brewing ale, and managing stores of dried provisions. You trudge into the largest tent, where an elder matron leans over a broad net, strung between wooden poles, hands deftly knotting torn meshes with twine spun from sheep's wool. This process, net sating, was both art and necessity, requiring precise, even stitches to prevent gaps that let herring escape. Archaeological finds at Kaupang reveal net weights and spindle whorls alongside domestic pottery, underscoring the centrality of female labor in fishing villages. Yet beyond utilitarian stitching lay fringe customs. Some coastal clans believed that as women wove repair knots, they should whisper the names of sea creatures, mermaids, seals, and sea-serpents, invoking local spirits' favor. One marginal ballad insists that when sea hag names were uttered in net-sating storms, abated, and fish shoals lingered, a practice scholars still debate as genuine folk ritual or later poetic flourish. You trudge to an adjacent tent where other women stand before long wooden vats filled with layers of fresh herring and coarse salt. They lift each salt-rimmed fish with gloved hands, stack them meticulously, and pack heavy barrels destined for winter storage. Mainstream trade ledgers from Hearty note that female oversights ensured consistent salt-to-fish ratios, critical in preventing spoilage and securing profitable export. Yet a whispered anecdote credits one master salter with secretly sprinkling juniper berries between layers, a botanical innovation said to deter moth larvae and add subtle zest. Historians still argue whether juniper salted herring was customary seasoning or an isolated culinary experiment. Nearby, a group of younger women tend to makeshift dyeing station vats of alder bark soak ropes and cloth in rich russet hues. These dyed ropes, used for halyards and lanyards, stood out against the gray decks, allowing sailors to quickly distinguish essential lines in poor light. Mainstream dyeing recipes from medieval textile manuals confirm that alder bark produced a durable red dye valued across Scandinavia. Yet fringe dyers' lore insists that dyeing under certain moon phases imbued ropes with extra resistance. To rot, a seasonal ritual scholars still debate as practical timing or superstition-driven tradition. You trudge along to a low bench where women sit shelling dried fish into small flakes, sorting them by size and quality. These flakes once mixed into barley porridge or used as seasoning formed vital protein supplements during lean months. Archaeological middens on Orkney Islands show fish flake discard layers dating to the 10th century, highlighting this practice's antiquity. Yet a marginalized farmstead chronicle claims that shelling was done in near silence. One wrong word during peeling could draw a sea spirit's ire, spoiling the season's catch. Scholars still argue whether this enforced hush was a widespread custom or cautionary tale to instill focus. In the tent's corner, a hearth glows under a cauldron of boiling goat's milk and crushed oats stirring a porridge known colloquially as haframjol. Women ladle thick bowls and hand them to returning fishermen whose faces glow with relief at the warm sustenance. Mainstream cookbooks of the era extol oats for their hearty fuel, while fringe herbalists recommend adding powdered kelp for iodine, a nod to early understanding of nutritional balance. Historians still debate whether kelp porridge was a regionally common practice or a niche remedy revived in modern coastal revivals. Your path leads to stacked boxes of barley malt and urns of coastal-grown juniper boughs. Here, women brew mjol, the staple ale of seafaring communities, thick with hearty grains and warming spices like angelica root. Mainstream fermentation studies confirm that medieval ale retained live yeast, providing essential dietary calories. Yet a fringe tavern song alleges that secret additions of seaweed ash in the mash imparted extra buoyancy to rowers, a claim scholars still dispute as fanciful lore or empirical observation. As dusk deepens, you trudge outside, where women carry out the final ritual, a communal blessing of the nets and barrels. They stand in a circle, each placing a hand on the salt-laden barrel and reciting an old coastal charm: salt and sea bind fish to me. Mainstream ethnographers document similar blessings in coastal villages, linking spiritual practice to community cohesion. Yet early chroniclers condemned such charms as pagan holdovers, leading to their gradual omission from written records. Historians still argue whether these ritual blessings survived into later Christianized periods or faded under ecclesiastical pressure. Finally, you trudge back toward the longship's rail, feeling the steady thrum of female labor that underpinned every voyage. The nets are repaired, the fish are cured, the ropes are dyed, and the ale is brewed thanks to hands both strong and skillful. Because in medieval Norse fishing, women at shore were not mere bystanders, they were master artisans, indispensable stewards of preservation, and bearers of rituals that turned every catch into a lasting legacy for their coastal kin. You trudge from the smoky shore camp back onto the longship's deck, where dawn's pale light glints off damp ropes, and the dragonhead prow looms like a silent sentinel. Above you, a pale sliver of sun hovers just beneath a veil of thin cloud, too low for ordinary sight to pinpoint at sea. Yet here, amid these northern waters, mariners mastered a secret navigational art, navigating by sunstones. In mainstream archaeological accounts, Norse sailors used crystalline sunstones, likely calcite or cordierite, to locate the sun's position on overcast days. When you trudge to the mast's shroud and grasp a triangular clear crystal, you hold the key to northern voyages. You angle the stone in front of your eye, rotating it until its polarized light reveals two bright spots marking the sun's hidden direction. Medieval references in Icelandic sagas hint at such tools described as solarsteiner, though physical examples remain rare, leading scholars to debate whether these stones were widespread navigational aids or confined to elite captains. You trudge toward the bow, lifting the crystal to catch the diffuse light. A faint crosswise flicker appears, two dark bands crossing the stone's surface. You watch as you twist the crystal slowly. The bands rotate until one band blurs, indicating the sun's azimuth despite the overcast sky. Modern experiments confirm that Iceland's spar crystals produce this polarization effect, enabling orientation within a few degrees. Yet historians still argue whether medieval crews understood the underlying physics or used the stone through learned instinct passed among select navigators. With the sun's bearing determined, you trudge to the steering oar at the stern. The helmsman shifts the blade to steer the ship toward that hidden light, aligning the vessel's prow with the sun's true bearing. Mainstream navigation treatises, later transcribed by coastal monks, recommend combining sunstone readings with wind direction wave patterns and bird flight to confirm heading. Yet fringe accounts from a single Faroese diary claim some captains carried multiple stones of different minerals, believing each crystal type revealed subtly different sun positions, an esoteric technique scholars still debate as sincere innovation or mere superstition. You trudge along the deck to consult a small wooden board inscribed with runic course markings, dots representing days' sail, and carved sea monsters marking shoal regions to avoid. Using your sunstone determined bearing, you trace the course from departure fjord to distant islands. Mainstream runologist studies confirm such rune boards, Naffenbrot, existed as mnemonic tools for professional navigators. Yet marginal folklore warns that runic boards could mislead if carved during an inauspicious tide, prompting heated scholarly debate on whether tides or astronomical factors guided runeboard timings. As the sky brightens, you trudge to the mast and unroll a small sail panel freshly patched with wool and linen. Its orientation marks the previous night's watch direction, a crude compass of wind shifts. You compare this wind compass to your sunstone reading together. They confirm your course due east, toward the whirlpool-known shoals. Mainstream ethnographic observations note that combining multiple navigation aids, stone wind, and plankton, blooms offered redundancy in treacherous waters. Yet a fringe navigator's rhyme insists that when aids conflict, one should trust the sunstone above all else, a diktat some crews followed even when it led them perilously close to hidden reefs. Historians still argue whether this rule of thumb reflects genuine practice or later romantic exaggeration. Below deck, a golden-hued sundial small bronze, engraved with cardinal runes, awaits the return of sunshine. When you trudge back later, you'll drop the sunstone lesson, positioning the dial's gnomon to calibrate both tools. Mainstream finds of small sundials in Viking-Age graves suggest that solar timekeeping coexisted with sunstone navigation. Yet critics point out that in high latitudes during summer, the sundial's multiple shadow lines complicate time reading a challenge medieval sailors overcame only through local experience, a point still debated among historians of science. You trudge back above. As gulls dive toward the sea, each bird's flight path hinting at coastal land beyond the visible horizon. You angle the sunstone, glazing toward the sun, and watch the polarized light betray the hidden sun's zenith angle, helping you estimate latitude. Modern reconstructions show that combining sunstone-derived altitude with horizon height observations offered surprising accuracy, enough to land on known islands without visible landmarks. Yet a lone monastic copy of Reichenau Itinerary wishes you could read latitude from dragonfly flight, another fringe notion historians still discuss for its poetic allure versus practical utility. As midday approaches, you trudge starboard to adjust the sail's sheet, setting a new angle for the wind's shift. The sunstone swings gently in your pocket, ready for the next overcast trial. Each time you use it, you blend hands-on crystal skill with ancestral lore and art as much tactile as mystical. Because in medieval Norse fishing, navigating by sunstones was not a mere curiosity. It was a testament to observational genius, a fusion of craft lore and instinct that guided crews through fog cloud and darkness, finding the sun's hidden path when all else lay veiled. You trudge from the sunstone-lit deck into the shaded enclosure beneath the aft castle, where a low wooden bench holds bundles of bracken and tubs of pungent brine, evidence of the camp's makeshift medical bay, where miners and fishermen alike sought relief from swollen joints and blackened gums. Here, among the flicker of oil lamps and the murmur of worried voices, you glimpse the rudiments of medieval Norse healthcare hospital bays and scurvy patches. In mainstream Norse practice, coastal communities recognized that long sea voyages and lean seasons bred ailments from cut lacerations to deadly scurvy. You trudge to a plank stretcher where a weather-beaten fisherman lies clutching a rag dipped in seaweed poultice on his inflamed gum line. Seaweed rich in vitamin C eased scurvy's earliest pangs, though observers didn't understand its nutritional chemistry. Saga fragments note that those who consumed fresh kelp broth during calms fared better than those confined to salted provisions. Yet historians still argue whether kelp's curative fame arose from empirical observation or later oral tradition. You trudge to a wooden rack bearing small leather pouches of dried crowberries, dark vitamin-rich fruits for tart squalls. Mainstream archaeological digs in Norse farm sites uncover crowberry seeds alongside fish bones, underscoring their role in supplementing deficient diets. Nonetheless, some elders warned that crowberry salves crushed and smeared on festering wounds stung fierce enough to deter landworms scavenging insects. Modern entomologists acknowledge that berry acids may irritate pests, but scholars still debate whether Norse healers intentionally used this as primitive insect control, or if the lore emerged centuries later. A hush falls as you trudge toward a stout wooden table where an elderly matron stirs a bubbling cauldron of reindeer fat and heather blossoms. She ladles small portions into shallow cups for patients suffering chest colds. Mainstream herbal manuals praise heather's expectorant properties. Fringe remedy scrolls add a pinch of driftwood ash to the mixture, claiming it enhanced lung-clearing vapors. Historians still debate whether ash additions held any pharmacological merit or served as symbolic tissue purges. Nearby, you trudge past a shelf of clay pots containing fish oil ointment for bruises and sprains. A fisherman percussion massages a shoulder with the greasy salve while whispering a charm. Bones of the wave, knit flesh near my sinew. Skeletal remains from Viking graves show traces of fish oil lineaments. Yet scholars still argue whether such healing incantations formed heartfelt ritual or faint echoes of pagan rites preserved beneath Christianization. You trudge further to a low cot draped in woven reindeer hide, where a youth with sunken cheeks and coughing fits lies. A healer offers him small tablets of compacted malt and birch yeast, an early probiotic designed to restore gut health after dysentery. Mainstream analyses of yeast cultures confirm benefits for digestion, though medieval practitioners likely stumbled upon them through trial and error. Yet a marginal farm journal warns that overconsumption caused vivid dreams of sea spirits, a side effect historians still debate as psychosomatic or genuine microbial fermentation byproduct. In one corner, you trudge past a small wooden chest labeled in runes Eyes Comfort. Inside, divided linens soaked in stinging nettle infusion await use on irritated eyes, a palliative for salt spray keratitis. Nettle's astringent properties provide relief. However, nursery rhymes caution that nettle leaf applications must avoid the pupil or vision's gate risks scalding. Scholars still debate whether this caution guided real practice or served as metaphor for respecting sight's fragility. At the bay's entrance, a carved wooden plaque depicts the god Air, patroness of healing, holding a cup and a bandaged arm. Fishermen paused here to trace Air's emblem before seeking treatment, a gesture of hope more than true invocation. Mainstream iconographers note Air's rare but persistent presence in Norse lore, yet fringe lapidary verses claim that invoking her name thrice prevented infection spreading an oral tradition. Historians still investigate for evidence or myth. You trudge back onto the deck, carrying away the scent of brine and herbs in your nostrils. Each poultice, each tablet, and each whispered charm reflects centuries of coastal ingenuity grappling with wounds and scourges amid waves. Because in medieval Norse fishing, hospital bays and scurvy patches were not mere afterthoughts. They were live theaters of folk pharmacology, blending herb fish oil and faith to tend battered bodies beneath shifting skies. You trudge from the ship's medical bay and follow a narrow spit of rock toward a cluster of low stone dwellings perched atop grassy knolls. Smoke drifts from peat-fueled hearths, and the air brims with the scent of drying fish and seaweed. This is Fair Isle's trading enclave, where Norse fishermen exchange salted herring and driftwood for local peat eiderdown and wool, an essential waypoint for trading at Fair Isles. Mainstream trading records note that Fair Isle, midway between Orkney and Shetland, served as a volatile hub for transitory fishermen. You trudge into the largest longhouse, where you find cheery Orcadian merchants bartering peat blocks for bundles of cured fish. Each peat block, vital for smoking fish and heating cabins, carries a distinctive smell of heather and bracken. Archaeological digs reveal peat store pits lined with turf markers dated to the 11th century, underscoring the isle's long role in energy exchange. Yet, beyond practical fuel sales, lay fringe accounts of moonlight peat runs. According to one 14th century ballad traders, arrived only under full moons to cut peat when the tides were lowest and the landscape shimmered silver, believed to bring richer smoke flavors to smoked fish. Historians still debate whether this moonlit timing improved peat quality or remained a poetic flourish woven into trading lore. You trudge toward stacked bundles of eider-down soft goose-plucked clusters secured in cloth sacks. Island women, adept at collecting breast down fallen in spring trade, these prized feathers for bolts of wool from the mainland. Mainstream guild charters confirm eiderdown's value in insulating cloaks and bedding, elevating Fair Isles exports beyond mere fish. Yet a fringe trader's log laments that unscrupulous merchants sometimes substituted goose feathers from thwarted roosts, prompting debates among historians over the scale of such substitutions and their impact on islander livelihoods. From a low table, you trudge to examine dyed wool skeins spun by local women, rich crimson and deep ochre hues imparted by island-grown lichens and local madder root. You lift a skein to your nose. The dye's earthy perfume tells of coast and soil. Mainstream textile analyses validate Fair Isles' unique color-fast dyes, whose recipes rarely appear in mainland dye books. Yet a marginal diary scribble claims that when storm winds grazed the knolls, the dye hues deepened overnight, an atmospheric effect scholars still debate as chemical darkening from salt spray or atmospheric moisture myths. Nearby, a burly trader unpacks a chest of Baltic amber beads traded southward by earlier Norse merchants and now prized in these remote isles. You trudge forward to negotiate the trade a barrel of herring for a string of polished amber. Mainstream trade ledgers note that amber signified status and was often melted into jewelry or amulets. Yet a fringe saga recounts that some islanders believed amber beads held bottled sunlight, warding off dark winter spirits, an interpretation historians still weigh as genuine island belief or later romanticization by antiquarians. As dusk falls, you trudge past a small dock where a battered Norse longboat lies beached. Its hull is covered with carved runic inscriptions pledging fair trade and safe passage. A local elder greets you with a carved wooden token, half a fish and half a peat block, symbolizing the isle's reciprocal economy. Mainstream numismatic studies liken these tokens to early tally sticks, tangible records of barter. Yet a fringe oral tradition claims that full trade rituals involved licking the token's carved surfaces, a ritual thought to seal the deal in the mouth of Odin's raven. Scholars still argue whether any eyewitness accounts corroborate such gustatory pledges or if they belong to poetic license. You trudge to the ship's rail bearing newly acquired peat and eiderdown, marveling at Fair Isles' self-sufficiency. Each traded bundle reflects careful stewardship of scarce island resources, a delicate balance maintained by generations of cooperation. Because in medieval Norse fishing trading at Fair Isles was not just commerce, it was a cultural exchange where fish fuel feathers and folklore intertwined to sustain island and ocean life alike. You trudge ashore under an endless pale sky where the horizon never darkens in midsummer's eternal twilight. Torches line a crude plank walkway to a low-ceilinged longhouse whose door yawns wide, spilling laughter and warm ale into the warm breeze. Inside benches sag under bodies, swaying to raucous tunes. Tankards clank on rough-hewn tables, and a smoky hearth crackles in the center. Here, after dawn's labors and dusk's chores, community bonds are forged in revelry, midnight drunken revel. In mainstream Norse coastal villages, brewing ale, mjod, and ull was as essential as fishing nets, offering calories, hygiene, and camaraderie. You trudge to a long trestle table, stacked with wooden tankards carved from oak and rowan. Each hand-milled cup bears runic inlays, symbols of harvest gratitude and clan kinship. As you lift a frothing mug, you taste honeyed barley ale, its warmth spreading through chilled limbs. Surviving skippers and deckhands toasted their safe passage, while shore workers praised nets that held fast and towbacks they would spin until dawn. Yet beyond the first sips lay fringe customs of the eternal toast. Legend held that at the summer solstice's peak, one had to toast each neighbor before the sun dipped to its lowest sliver, 15 mugs in total, to secure a year of bountiful herring runs and fair weather. Skaldic verses warn, miss but one, and the fjord shall turn cold and barren. Historians still debate whether counts of 15 reflect actual ritual or poetic license echoing lunar and solar cycles. You trudge along to where a circle of villagers drums wooden spoons on barrel staves, keeping a primitive beat as couples whirl an unsteady dance. A local fiddler, his instrument crudely fashioned from driftwood strains, on a single string, producing a drone that underpins lilting melodies. Mainstream ethnomusicology notes that such shore dance traditions blended Norse and Celtic influences, evolving into reel-like patterns. Fringe researchers claim that certain tune intervals mimic gull cries, believed to attract seabirds and foretell next day's catch. Scholars still argue whether any acoustic lure effect existed or if the notion arose from imaginative skalds. The heat of ale and motion quickens your pulse. You trudge to join a group playing horn throw, a jostling game of flung ram's horn pieces, aiming them to land upright in marked circles. Rules vary by isle. Some grant a bonus toast for perfect landings. Others demand a rowing shift for near misses. Mainstream sport ethnographers link horn throw to skills honed in shipboard life, aim strength and balance, while fringe lore insists that a flawless throw pierce the veil to the world of sea spirits, granting prophetic dreams. Historians still debate whether such claims held any verifiable tradition beyond spirited storytelling. As the revel peaks, you trudge toward the hearth, where an elder pours a potent honey mead aged in birch barrels. Its heady sweetness cloaks a burn that draws tears. Each swallow warms the chest and loosens tongues. You share a tankard with a crusty fisherman who confesses to saving a single silver herring scale, polished and hidden in his cloak, as a talisman against lean winters. Mainstream folk belief compendiums confirm that herring scales were carried as good luck charms. Yet a fringe entry in a 12th century chronicle suggests scales could double as emergency currency among destitute wives. A debate scholars still weigh as uncommon barter or cautionary myth. You trudge to the outskirts where children sit entranced, watching masked revelers in boar-hide costumes enact the fish god rites, stomping and howling to chase away evil tide demons. Mainstream ritual studies point to such mummers' plays as seasonal catharsis, symbolic scaring of pests from crops and nets. Yet marginal accounts from missionaries decry the performances as pagan folly, prompting debates over the degree of Christian influence and tolerance in remote fishing hamlets. A sudden chorus rises as the fiddler strikes into a faster tempo. You trudge back to the benches where tankards flow anew and voices shout chorus lines, laughter echoing in the high-ceilinged hall. The longhouse littered with spilled ale, fish bones, and drifting feathers from earlier feasts becomes a living tapestry of communal resilience, where hardship and mirth wove tightly beneath the unsetting sun. Because in medieval Norse fishing, midnight drunken revels were not mere indulgence, they were the heart's reprieve, a collective pulse of joy, myth and memory that buoyed each fisherman's spirit against the fjord's uncertain tides. You trudge onto the deck at dawn's first pale glow, the horizon rimmed with faint pink and the sea's glassy surface barely ruffled by a gentle breeze. A low mist drifts among the oaken thwarts, and the scent of brine mingles with the metallic tang of axe blades freshly drawn from leather sheaths. Today is not for nets or oars, but for canalizing the longship's latent fury into weapons and shields. Longship warfare prep, where every axe edge and boss rim must gleam beneath the rising sun. You trudge to the arms rack along the starboard rail, where double-headed battle axes lean against the hull, their steel heads reflecting the rosy sky. In mainstream accounts of Viking-Age naval expeditions, longships served dual purposes: fishing vessels by day and swift attack craft when raiding or defending shorelines. You lift the haft of one axe, its grain of ash wood still warm from the craftsman's workshop, and run your gloved thumb along the blade's spine. The iron-forged tune rings clear, confirming its temper and resilience. Historians still argue whether shipboard forges ever performed actual blade tempering at sea, or if final sharpening occurred only ashore before departure. Beside the axe's round shields hang from pegs planks of laminated pine or linden bound with rawhide rims and painted bold red and white. You trudge forward and lift one shield by its central grip, feeling the weight of solid wood and iron boss. Mainstream shield excavations from Hedeby and Dublin show these shields averaged 18 to 20 inches across, perfectly sized for blocking spear thrusts and axe swings on crowded deck combat. Yet fringe martial lore claims some shield makers in coastal villages added powdered mussel shell to hide glue, creating a harder rim that snapped spearheads like brittle reeds. Scholars still debate whether any such shell-infused hide treatments appear in period artifacts or remain speculative embellishment. You trudge to a low bench where two grizzled deckhands crouch over whetstones soaked in fish oil mixture plates of coarse grit sandstone hollowed into shallow basins. The rasp of steel on stone punctuates the salty air as they draw each blade downward in even strokes. Mainstream martial manuals transcribed by later scribes recommend stropping axes on oiled leather after wetting to polish edges and remove burrs. Yet an obscure commentary in a 10th century runic stele warns that overstropping blunts the dawn's kiss, suggesting that some smiths believed too much polishing robbed the axe of its sacred bite. Historians still argue whether this reflects poetic metaphor or an authentic debate over edge maintenance. A shrill cry echoes from the bow as a youth tests his new spear tip by tossing it into the sky and catching its haft, an apprentice's show of confidence. You trudge toward him, noting how the iron tip spins smoothly, the haft meticulously bound with spiraling leather strips. Mainstream spearhead hoards from deposit sites confirm a range of hog-backed and leaf-shaped forms optimized for thrusting between shield ranks. Yet a fringe blacksmith's notebook extols a rare triangular tip shape, claiming it created a thrice gleaming wound that sowed confusion among foes. Scholars still debate whether triangular spearheads existed beyond poetic invention or limited experimental use. Above you, the sun peaks above a distant peak, illuminating the deck's scattered armor helmets, mail coifs, and greaves laid out on planks to air in the sun's purifying rays. You trudge to a chainmail shirt, its interlocking rings of iron looped with mustard oil residue to slow rust. Mainstream textile metalwork analyses show that mail shirts brinjure were rare among fishermen, but more common when raiding expeditions expected combat. Yet an outlier saga fragment describes a fisherman's brotherhood who wore lightweight mail under wool tunics called salt hammers, designed to resist spear thrusts while remaining pliable for rowing. Historians still argue whether such mail usage among fishing crews was widespread or confined to warrior merchants. Your boot scrapes a helmet brim as you trudge to inspect a conical cap resting on a barrel. Its leather interior is sealed with pitch to repel water. You lift it and peer inside handwritten runes along the liner invoke Odin's sight and Thor's strength. Mainstream epigraphic finds include similar runic inscriptions on weapons and helmets offering both blessing and brand. Yet fringe rune priests asserted that inscribing runes at dawn before wearing the helmet locked in the god's favor for the day's battle. Scholars still debate whether these rune invocations occurred routinely or were exceptional ceremonial acts. Suddenly, the deck shudders as a wave brushes the hull, reminder that preparation must be swift. You trudge to a row of bales containing windbreak shields, layers of wool and oak, held by iron straps stacked to form temporary barricades during boarding actions. Mainstream tactical guides advise setting these shields in tight semicircles to protect archers during ranged harassment. Yet a marginal war poem lauds the wolf hedge, a circular barricade named for its impenetrable strength, said to hold off 10 attackers at once. Historians still argue whether such tactics crossed from battlefield memoirs into naval skirmishes or remained bardic fantasy. You trudge to a coffer of fire arrows, wooden shafts tipped with canvas soaked in pitch and tar, designed to set enemy ships alight. Each shaft is meticulously spun to ensure pitch layers adhere evenly. Mainstream warfare treatises mention incendiary tactics at sieges and sea engagements, though the risk of wind shift made fire arrows less common at sea. Yet a Lone Island Chronicle claims that during a midnight skirmish, a well-aimed fire arrow ignited a rival longship, turning its deck into a blazing beacon and forcing a retreat. Scholars still debate whether sea-based fire arrow use was strategic gem or rare cautionary tale. As the sun climbs fully, you trudge back to the middeck and help lash the weapons rack shut, securing every blade and spear for transit. The longship's arsenal gleams in the high light, a silent promise of both defense and offense. You gather your own axe, checking its haft for cracks and its edge for nicks, tending it as carefully as you would your nets. Because in medieval Norse fishing, warfare preparation was not mere armament. It was a disciplined ritual of maintenance, ritual, and readiness, ensuring that every pulse of sea fog and every shadowed cove could become a moment of danger turned to decisive defense. You trudge from the weapons rack and ease the longship into the muted glow of dawn breaking over familiar shores. The mist curls like restless spirits around rocky skerries, and gulls wheel above calling you home. Salt crusts your clothes and brine still drips from every rope. Your muscles hum from oar strokes. Your hands ache from nets and whetstones. Yet nothing compares to the quiet relief of seeing the harbor's narrow channel beckon you back to land. This is Return to Harbor, the final act in the long voyage's dance. Mainstream coastal sagas describe the homecoming as sacred rowers leaned low on oars, synchronizing each pull to prayers of thanksgiving, while captains guided the keel between sandbanks charted in memory. You trudge to your oarlock for one last push, tasting both salt and anticipation. The channel's markers, stacked stones, and driftwood totems emerge through thinning fog. Centuries of use have worn their shapes into the granite bedrock. Yet each crew reads these landmarks anew, blending old knowledge with this season's shifting currents. Historians still argue whether coastal markers followed formal codes inscribed in land charters or grew organically through communal tradition. You trudge toward the bow, where a veteran deckhand holds a carved wooden post called a sea marker rod. He dips its tip into the water, then lifts it to examine the drained line, measuring depth by the grain of its wet markings. Mainstream seamanship manuals from 11th century monasteries mention such sounding poles as essential for safe approach. Yet fringe logs whisper of secret markings, tiny nicks denoting safe passages only known to the most trusted captains. Scholars debate whether these micro-notches influenced actual navigation or stood as mystic privileges to preserve elite knowledge. As the longship's prow nudges the sandy shallows, you feel the hull scrape once, twice, with a muted groan of oak surrendering to land. You trudge to the oar racks and lift each oar free of its leather ring, stacking them neatly along the deck's center. Mainstream accounts note that organized stowage prevented gear from washing away at high tide, while fringe treatises recommend tying each oar with a sprig of yew to ward off capricious sea spirits seeking to drag them underwater. Historians still debate whether yew talismans formed genuine practice or grew from poetic misinterpretations of timber selection. You trudge up the ramp to the quay, where villagers line the stone pier, their faces bright with smiles and calls. Children clutch fresh catcher's baskets, ready to strip the hull's barnacles later. Elders carry wooden bowls of hot porridge to warm shivering limbs. A mother waves you forward, brandishing a knitted woolen cap, your old headpiece you left drying on the masthead. Mainstream social histories highlight these welcome traditions as vital to communal cohesion, while fringe ethnographies suggest they rooted in ancient fertility rites. Returning fishermen symbolized seed sowers re-entering the earth. Scholars still argue whether such fertility symbolism influenced daily rituals or remained the province of lyrical folklore. You trudge over the gangplank, solid oak, carved with knotwork, and touch firm ground again. Dock workers reach up to grasp the longship's rails, guiding the hull into its berth between two sturdy posts. Ropes loop overhead as crewmates secure bow and stern lines, tying them with bow knots taught in childhood. Mainstream ropework guides confirm bow knots' balance of strength and quick release. Yet a marginal, knot-tying tome adds that tying with the left hand first honors Freyja Luckbringer. In Voyages, a superstition scholars still debate as genuine Norse devotion or later romantic revival. With the hull secured, you trudge down to the dock's edge and lift your boots from the deck. The cold moisture gives way to the solid warmth of stone. You trudge to the longhouse, where your kin await blood pounding with relief. Each step draws out the lingering creaks of the longship's timbers echoing in your bones. The harbor exudes calm nets hang to dry in salty air. Salted fish barrels line the quay, and smoke drifts from each hearth. Mariners share jokes about near-miss reefs, boast of fish counts, and swap tales of storm giants and sunstones. You trudge to embrace a friend who slaps you heartily on the back, then to your partner who presses a hand to your face, tasting salt and sweat. Because in medieval Norse fishing, return to harbor was not just the end of a voyage, it was a ritual passage from sea to shore, weaving distance and danger into homecoming, grounding each soul in community hearth and the promise of stories shared under shelter after salt and mist. Sweet dreams.